On today's special edition of World Insight, from a fishing village to a bustling tech hub, it's the 4-decade story of rapid migration, exponential growth, and ambition. This is Shenzhen 40 Years On. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Today, we bring you our special program marking the 40th anniversary of China's Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. It's been said that Shenzhen, a southern Chinese small city, was forged from reform and strengthened with opening up. It was in 1978 that China did decide to pursue reform and opening up policy. And 2 years later, in August 1980, the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone came into being, a magnet for direct foreign investment and cross-border trade. The hustle-bustling metropolis is at the heart of tremendous changes in China over the last 40 years. This once little fishing hamlet has now become one of the most vibrant cities in the world. Now, with a population of over 12 million, it's home to several big Chinese tech companies, including Huawei, Tencent, ZTE, and the list goes on. Bordering Hong Kong, it is part of the China Greater Bay Area Development Plan, which connects Hong Kong, Macao, and 8 other major cities in southern China. So what makes Shenzhen so attractive and different? What risks and opportunities lie ahead for this miracle city? How to reflect back on its history and look forward to its future? Today, we invited a strong panel from different parts of the world who witnessed and took part in the city's growth. For more on the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, we have in Shenzhen Xiao Geng, professor at Peking University HSBC Business School. In Beijing, Professor Fu Jun, academic dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. Also, Shenzhen, we have Professor Xing Hou, who is assistant professor in finance with Peking University HSBC Business School once again, and in Shenzhen, Marco Forster, who is a senior associate with International Business Advisory, Shenzhen office of Dezan Shira and Associates. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. I know 3 of you, Professor Oh, Professor Xiao, and Mr. Forster, are all in Shenzhen right now. Good to see all of you. Tell me about when did you arrive in Shenzhen, what you are doing there, what's the link between your life, your professional life, and Shenzhen. Let's start from Mr. Forster.
I just moved to Shenzhen earlier this year, but I've been in China since 2014. We're working here as an international business advisory, FDI advisory, for foreign investors who want to enter the market. I was in Beijing before and recently just relocated within the company. Because Shenzhen is somewhat our cradle of our company. We've been established here in 1992 and have expanded from Shenzhen throughout China. Many of our clients here, and this has always been an attractive market. And we see a big change coming up from manufacturing companies to more service-oriented clients. So that's why I'm excited to be here and to stay here for a little longer.
Interesting, relocated from Beijing to Shenzhen. Mr. Oh, right. Professor, from South Korea originally. Tell me about your story with Shenzhen.
I came to Shenzhen in 2014, right after graduating PhD in US. And then I lived my 7th year in Peking University, HSBC School. I'm teaching finance, particularly entrepreneurial finance, mergers and acquisition, and this is Center of Innovation. First few years when I came to Shenzhen, I feel like this is something like a successful startup companies, and then with a lot of potentials. And I find out that all this potential become reality in the last few years. And then I'm really happy to be part of this city and the rapid economic growth here.
What do you mean by all the potentials? What are some of the potentials you're referring to?
So I would say the remarkable progress and changes in the city is the structural transformation of this industry composition of city. So in a simple way, what the beginning of Shenzhen is all about the traditional manufacturing and then export and import with the geographic advantages with the Hong Kong. But right now, as you can see, the Shenzhen is full of the more sophisticated industries such as high tech and the financial and legal industry become a major part of this economics here. So I think the transformation is very remarkable within a short period of time in Shenzhen. I think this was the amazing potential that Shenzhen has and it become reality.
Interesting. Professor Xiao, you've been moving around from Beijing to Hong Kong and now in Shenzhen, also working in HSBC, listening to your younger colleagues' comments about Shenzhen. What is your life's link to this city and how do you see your reality there?
I think Shenzhen is so attractive as part of the Greater Bay Area. So that's why I think I'm moving here. And right now, it's really exciting because the contrast between Hong Kong and Shenzhen makes me believing that the future of Shenzhen is really great. Here, you can see people are busy and happy, and a lot of new things. It's the most open, market-oriented, but on the other hand, the government is actually doing a lot of things. Yeah.
From the earlier fishing village of Shenzhen to what it is today, Professor Xiao, over the decades, how do you see the earlier stories is related to the current development of Shenzhen?
I came here 28 years ago, and at that time, Shenzhen is a very small city, but already very, very busy. And the reason is because of the manufacturing. And Hong Kong's manufacturing has been basically relocated to Shenzhen, and export is booming. As a result, Shenzhen becomes an industrial city and actually spill over to the neighboring cities and gradually become concentrated on technology and also services, financial services in particular. The Shenzhen stock market actually is doing quite well, all the years compared to Shanghai. Even though it's it's smaller, but there are a lot of activities here in venture capital. Almost all this so-called new economy, and particularly I think. Some names are really striking, the Huawei, Tencent, Ping An, and the China Merchant, all these Dajiang, all these great companies. Basically, when I first came, it's not really big names, but now it's the global names. Yeah. The city is really becoming a global city.
Professor Oh, you may have heard that at the very beginning of Shenzhen, the reform and opening up process is mainly about migrant workers going to Shenzhen, going to the manufacturing sector, produce cheap products and export to different parts of the world. And now where you are has certainly been a very different story. How do you, as a latecomer, quote unquote, relate the earlier story with the current one?
The remarkable transformation of industry in this Shenzhen is a result from the Shenzhen's great infrastructure and platform the development. So, for example, I want to emphasize the development of intellectual property, the infrastructures, the development in Shenzhen. So, in line with some national-wide changes in all this IT right protection and enforcement, the Shenzhen actually had a very remarkable progress in pursuing the better protection of this IT. So thanks to this strengthened IT rights, the more innovative companies find Shenzhen as the best home to develop their products and services.
What about foreign direct investment, Mr. Forrester? At this time, when geopolitics is still a big problem, are people still interested in FDI into Shenzhen compared to other Chinese cities?
We've been helping a few European companies and also American companies to set up in the last 6 months remotely. This works as well, but of course, during a company incorporation here, at a certain point, for example, for the bank account opening or for the initial tax registration at the tax bureau, we need the legal representative, who's then oftentimes someone who's stuck abroad, to be physically in China. And that hasn't worked so well in the past because they couldn't enter the country anymore. So we hope that there will be, first of all, a little bit of relaxation of the travel restrictions, but also maybe a relaxation from the bank side to maybe have an online interview instead of a physical meeting at the branch abroad. We know that in Hong Kong, banks have done such relaxations, but in mainland China, we haven't seen it so far. But the interest is nevertheless there.
That, I'm sure, is the side story. But the main story is still the Shenzhen and its relations with China's overall agenda of reform and opening up. With that, we are so glad once again to be joined by Professor Fu Jun and also Mr. Yu Kong Huang. Mr. Huang, who is a senior associate in the Carnegie Asia program. Mr. Huang also worked in China for years and experienced, witnessed, and even participated in China's reform and opening up process. So, Mr. Huang, good to see you. Tell me, with more historical aspect, Mr. Huang, about the earlier day Shenzhen to the current Shenzhen that you have in mind.
So when I first came to China as a World Bank director in '97, and you go back to '97, you go to Shenzhen, you can't even find it practically in a physical sense. So it's an astounding story about how you actually create something from nothing. People came, and you're connected to the world. And back then, it was heavily influenced by the fact that China is getting ready to join WTO. And the connectivity of the South in terms of trade, which became the driver of China's growth in the late 90s all the way through about 2010, I think is the story of Shenzhen. Today, when I think about Shenzhen, you now have a city of 15, 20 million people, and everybody in that city came from somewhere else, which makes Shenzhen unique. And this reminds me of what it is like in the United States in terms of the creation of innovation and internet kinds of services in the Silicon Valley. In the sense that everybody there came from somewhere else in the United States, and they all came to this one place. And what they found was that physical presence matters. And I say this because the Shenzhen of the future will probably be less focused on manufacturing exports, but it's going to be about innovation, the internet, new ideas, new kinds of activities, and new services. So what I see as the potential challenge for Shenzhen is the move to what I call more creative services in the future. Because this is what China needs to look forward to. And the back was sort of like manufacturing exports. The future is services, in particular high-value services. And high-value services, they are basically created in large cities where you have people come together to exchange ideas, and physical presence matters. So for me, the future for Shenzhen is services, creative services, and whether they can, in fact, be the center of that for all of China.
All of us have great expectations for Shenzhen. What about for you, Professor Fu?
I want to look back to the history a little bit so that we look at Shenzhen as a window through which we understand the whole reform and open up process. Shenzhen is such a big thing. And to contrast Shenzhen, we have to understand Xiaogang. Xiaogang is, well, we are now looking at the rural reforms in China. It's rather a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. It's the peasants in that village that took things in their own hands, and they signed a somewhat secretive contract in which they said, well, we'll give whatever is owned to the state, whatever is owned to the collective, and we'll keep whatever is left to us. And that is a tremendous boost compared to the commune, people's commune system, where they have to hand in everything to the state. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, this is the Xiaogang's story. And through that contract, household responsibility that institutionally changed relationship between peasants to the commune system. They are freed up from the land. Once they have done their job, they are free to do whatever they would like to do. So from there, you will see a boost of township village enterprises in the vast rural area in China. Yeah. And Shenzhen, of course, is a part of that process. So early on, and still today, probably, if you look at the composition of the population of Shenzhen, the bulk of the population comes from other parts of the world, migrant workers. And this is the labor story. And of course, there is also the land story. And Shenzhen was the first place for us to set up a land market. And there we also learned a bit from Hong Kong, then the capital markets. And Shenzhen, you have the stock exchange, where I had the honor to serve as a member of the first listing committee. So I know a little bit of that. But the interesting story of Shenzhen was that it started from a fishing village as a special economic zones, and that fishing village in a 1 year span was elevated very rapidly to a administrative level of vice ministers that give them a special ranking so that they can report economic affairs directly to the state council. Right. So in that way, they isolated from probably resistance from the rest of the China, so that they, from the very beginning, they were market-oriented and international-oriented.
So much history about Shenzhen, really, particularly at the very beginning of it. Mr. Huang, I'm sure you echo some of Professor Fu's earlier comments. The audacity of the people then in starting up this reform process, this bottom-up approach rather than top-down approach, and this courage that people have to be able to break out of the earlier frame and push the envelopes. All of this contribute to the success that we are seeing today of this special economic zone, Shenzhen. Mr. Huang.
The migrant worker story is amazing. It's amazing because in some ways it's spontaneous. It was not something that the government actually sponsored. People actually moved on their own. Yes. After all, if they moved to these various places, in the beginning, most of them would not get residency rights, so they don't have hukou. And they were considered as temporary workers, and they would go back, and they can't bring their families. So what's a remarkable story in terms of the migrant workers in China is that it was driven by themselves. And that, of course, is then reflected in the kinds of people who actually move. They have to be adventuresome. I mean, this is parallel, actually, to the story of the United States. America is a country of immigrants. Immigrants show a curiosity, initiative, entrepreneurial talent. And that's why America is strong, because it has so many immigrant people from all over the world. And China, the migrant worker is the parallel story, that they're actually moving. And so you have as many, at peak, 250 million migrant workers in China, concentrated primarily along the coastal commercial centers like Shenzhen. What's going to be interesting in the next 10 years is there's going to be probably a different kind of a migration. Some of it's coming back from the coastal areas to the central provinces. And that's because as China becomes much more consumption services oriented, you're going to see the location of activity slowly moving actually a little bit more inland. And what's driving that is the high-speed rail network. The high-speed rail network connects China north-south, east-west. It actually has this interesting effect of actually creating and moving the center of activity a little bit more in the center of China. And it makes sense because a third of the population in China is in the west, a third is along the coast, a third is along the central provinces. Right. So I think this very interesting aspect of what Shenzhen represents is this willingness of people and activity to move. And move you have to, because economic conditions change.
And you're watching World Insight special program marking the 40th anniversary of China's Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. Stay with us. We'll be back after the break. Shenzhen is a historic story. It's also an economic story, migrant worker story. It's also a political story. Professor Xiao, I'm sure you remember at the very beginning when the decision was being made out of the high-level discussion, but at the same time, bottom-up approach. And at critical time, for example, at the very beginning of the 1990s, there were certain difficulties for China to connect with the rest of the world. And Mr. Deng Xiaoping made his well-known speech then and his tour to Shenzhen to talk about the vision of China's reform and opening up, in a way revived another period of new stages of reform and opening up in this country. Professor Xiao, I'm sure you remember that very well as an economist.
You know, Shenzhen Special Economic Zone is really the platform for China to make a basically turn from planned economy to market economy. But then in 1992, you know, really starting from that year, China started to attract foreign direct investment, first from Hong Kong and then from Taiwan, from, you know, other countries. So because Shenzhen is next to Hong Kong, so politically, basically Deng Xiaoping thinks that Shenzhen has to be catching up with Hong Kong at least in terms of lifestyle and also in terms of business environment. And I think this is a very important factor because Hong Kong is something there, and you just can't change. You know, it is a completely open economy, free market economy. So as an enabler, so Shenzhen basically catching up with Hong Kong, you know, in the last few decades, and that is so important for China because for most foreigners, you know, they come to Hong Kong, they say, oh, this is really at home, you know, Hong Kong is great. But now you can see Shenzhen is actually very close in terms of lifestyle and business environment to, you know, Hong Kong. But Shenzhen also has an advantage. Shenzhen is actually benefiting from like the best part of the two worlds, you know, the Chinese system's advantage, but also the free market, you know, open economy advantage. So I think in terms of China's reform, Shenzhen is really a critical piece.
China is facing another stage of reform and opening up. For example, there's much more geopolitics these days. China is becoming much stronger competition, and some see even China's rivalry. And also there's the issue of what kinds of reform and opening up China wants to do, and how is it related to China's role for international governance and international cooperation. And at the same time, it has a lot to do with China's own domestic agenda. What kind of China does China aspire to become? You know, what kind of lifestyle do the Chinese have in their mind? So, Professor Fu, next stage of reform and opening up, is Shenzhen much of an inspiration, even though that was a story started 40 years ago?
Well, we have been using the word reforms and opening up reform and opening up. In fact, everywhere in the world, people are talking about reforms. But now we have to be clear about the direction towards which we need to reform the system. Now, if we have a lesson to learn from the past, let me start with a number, which I think is very interesting. When we started reform and opening up 40 years ago, some 40 years ago, our GDP per capita here in China was $156 US. Okay, for now it's 10,000. For us to move from that low base to 10,000, the better ones in the world we now can see is 60,000. We still have a long way to go. Now, how to explain the story of moving from 156 to 10,000? Internally, it's reform, but it's market-oriented reforms. But there we have our own strategies. The way we basically do is to keep the old system, but let the new system grow on the peripheral of the old system. Over time, now a market-oriented system has taken the bulk of the system. So it is so critical for China to be in a system that is open globally, and we need to be open both to the advanced part of the world system and also to the developing part of the system, so that the world economy will continue to grow. Because here you are talking about the supply and the demand side.
Right.
You need to have a reasonable match between the supply and the demand. I see professors, quite a bulk of professors, also from Shenzhen. And the Shenzhen government is very aware of the fact for them to move further. What they need to do is to be innovative. And that means they need to have a sophisticated education. And they have now they start to invest it heavily in education. And this is all part and parcel of China's story of continue to reform itself and keep itself open to the rest of the world.
That's an important aspect, Mr. Huang. Evolving role of China internationally and also its domestic agenda and the role of Shenzhen inspiration it could provide to all of us in the near future. Your take?
If you go back over the last 20 years, what you see is that China has been exceptional in its ability to tap and acquire foreign knowledge and foreign direct investment, and then to spread that knowledge domestically in a way that many firms learn from that. That's China's success story. When you grow by 10% a year, maybe half of it is from just pure investment. Half of it comes from productivity and transfer, and that's what the Shenzhen example is. And when you compare China with other countries, no other country has done this as well as China. Now, the critical way, the important way that China did this, actually, which is somewhat unique, is that it used joint ventures with foreign companies, and in the process managed to transfer the knowledge faster and spread it deeper than any other country they've ever seen. And that's become a sensitive issue now in the U.S.-China trade war, because the West asks whether that joint venture arrangement, which allows that knowledge to be transferred domestically, is it fair or not fair? From a China perspective, they would say there's nothing wrong with this. It's a voluntary commercial transaction. Companies don't have to transfer it. So I think the Shenzhen example and the joint ventures which exist there is actually an illustration of a major issue that's facing the world. To what extent is the transfer of knowledge from the West or from more advanced countries to developing countries, should it be supported, or do you need to address it because some people think it's unfair? It's interesting, if you actually look at the WTO guidelines, there's a statement in the guidelines which actually says that developed countries are obligated to encourage the transfer of knowledge to developing countries. Not many people realize that, because right now the trade war, the technology transfer criticism is this question of the transfer. So I think this question of the opening up, as Professor Fu said, opening up in the future is going to be a lot more focused on this issue of the transfer of knowledge to continue. How should you do it? And I think that this kind of experiment and examples will be played out in Shenzhen in the future.
Professor Oh, coming from your perspective and your several years experience in Shenzhen, where do you think the impetus will be, and where do you think the energy will be? What is going to be, the current days comparison to, the very beginning of the bottom-up approach and energy existed in the public about reform and opening up in China? What's your observation with the Shenzhen story?
So, giving a little bit about the background story. So all this innovation is very sensitive to the innovation information disclosure to the public, because once I reveal more my innovation information to the public, my competitor are going to use this information to benefit, and then there's a potential imitation risk. But with this strengthen this IPs and a better protection enforcement, this legal the platforms. Now all these companies have been more comfortable doing their innovation, and they have a proper the disclosure of this company's innovation outcomes. And it has very subsequent benefits. One, it might minimize sort of information gap between the company and the stock market participants. It basically improved the sort of a lot of financial systems And second, there's a lot of knowledge spillover, as mentioned by other panels. So the other like the companies and then the people can learn about this, the ongoing successful innovation, and it has a positive knowledge spillover to other firms and the public in general. So I think that this underlying the platform is a very important the reason why and how the Shenzhen made it such a big economic growth in the last decades.
Mr. Forrester, what about what Mr. Huang earlier said? What's going to be the new engine for growth and desire to work and also to cooperate with Shenzhen, and for Shenzhen to see its new stage of reform and opening up?
I think Professor Fu and Professor Huang have mentioned a very important point there. What we've seen 40 years ago, also with the joint venture laws, opening up to FDI, first from Hong Kong, the rest of the world, was really unseen before in China, and has probably sparked the single most largest wealth creation humanity has ever seen in such a short amount of time. Yeah. Now, what can be done in Shenzhen, or what could be done in Shenzhen back then, can be really done all over the country. You can set up a company in Shanghai, or in Beijing, or in Hangzhou. What is really special about Shenzhen, or what could make Shenzhen special again, is if they really have a second wave of reform there, a further deepening of the reform, second wave of opening up as well, to really show the rest of the country again Shenzhen can step forward and bring forward this pioneering spirit. When we look at the Greater Bay Area Initiative, for example, the GBA, we see that this is a large plan connecting the different cities in the Pearl River Delta here. We see the infrastructure projects between Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Guangzhou, that everything is tying closely together. However, for European companies and FDI in particular, the European Chamber, for example, has just launched a business confidence survey and published it in June this year. The majority of the companies has heard of this plan, is very aware of the GBA. I believe it was 89%, but also 63%, unfortunately, said that they do not benefit from it. So we have the infrastructure in place, and we have maybe not yet the regulatory framework in place enough for giving all of these companies the level playing field they need to excel and to again spark the second wave of growth for Shenzhen.
That's an interesting point, Professor Fu. On the one hand, you have the geopolitics going, and politicians using, certain emotions or attitudes of the business world for their political purposes. Of course, there are certain issues that needs to be addressed anyway. However, on the other hand, you also see China is at a crossroad. Now we talk about dual circulation, we talk about the increasing domestic consumption. It's also about how China is looking at the structure of its economy for the future in terms of its relation with the rest of the world. So, Professor Fu, could you help us to understand what's going to be this relation when China continues its reform and opening up with foreign companies?
Now, China's aggregate GDP is number 2 in the world. That sounds enormous to a lot of people. But when you look at GDP per capita, it's below world average. World average is about 12,000. Ours is about 10,000. Yeah. Historically, 200 years ago, we had roughly 1/3 of the world's total population. We were producing roughly a bit over 1/3 of total GDP of the world. Then, of course, every country was more or less in the mode of agriculture. Now, in industrialization, because of some countries move ahead first, others were catching up, and China is a country that was in the business of catching up. And with that uniqueness, in aggregate bound number 2, but in GDP per capita is still below world average. So China need to think very clearly. On the one hand, they need to continue to learn globally, because they are better performing ones that we learn. And several layers we need to look at. One is sort of the physical costs of growth. There you are looking at sort of natural capital, human capital, and the physical capital. The other is institutional capital. This is the more subtle. This is the invisible hand. How do you arrange power? How do you arrange market? How do you arrange society? So these sort of the invisible stuff, and this is very critical because different ways to arrange that will give different levels of flexions when you mix land, labor, capital.
Absolutely.
And the other part is the incentive system. This is also very critical. When we look at the Xiaogang, when we look at the early story of Shenzhen, incentives was much higher than the rest of China. That's why Shenzhen had moved way ahead.
Professor Fu raised a lot of deep-rooted issues and also profound questions. Mr. Huang, your take about exactly the road that China wants to walk down in the near future, and certainly its relations with Shenzhen's future.
What I would say is the past 20, 30 years, China has shown that it has become extraordinarily productive in manufacturing. It's also the largest trading nation. It's the second largest recipient of foreign direct investment, next to the United States. If you look forward to the next 10 to 15 years, and you ask what is going to be different, and what's different is China's economy is now largely driven by services, no longer by manufacturing. That's different. And the key to going from a $10,000 per capita GDP to $30,000, $40,000 per capita GDP is whether you have high-value services, not just in manufacturing. Now, what should China do to actually encourage this? If you look at China's investment regime, it is quite actually open in terms of letting products come in, but it's still very restrictive in allowing foreign services to come in. And if it opened it up to more foreign services, this would put pressure on Chinese services to improve, compete. And China would, I think, benefit, just as it benefited from manufacturing, lowering in tariffs, and becoming a manufacturing power. So I think the challenge for China in the future is, should it become much more liberal in opening up its investment regime to foreign services? And I think it should, because I actually think China is ready. 10 or 15 years ago, the concern was that if you opened up the services sector to foreign companies, China companies would not be able to compete. And they're talking about in finance, equity markets, securities, education, insurance, business practices, legal, advertising, retailing. And this is, I think, the key issue for China in the future. And what I've seen in the last 5, 6, 10 years is China is now ready. It has strong competitors. It has the capacity. It can actually take on what I call the global giants in these areas. And they don't really have to worry about this. So for me, opening up in the future is whether China will open up and allow a lot more competition in services.
Professor Xiao, China's playbook, and certainly what's going to be the playbook of Shenzhen, all are interlinked. Professor.
In the next 5, 10 years, even 20 years, China is going to have basically 2 tracks, internal and external, like economy, largely because the political, social systems, China is socialist, but most of the countries are capitalist. So in that sense, Shenzhen will play a very important role as the external side, So it can actually fully open, just like Mr. Huang mentioned, open the service sector, open the technology, open the financial sector, and as basically demonstration that even under the socialist political system, China can continue to have world-class market economy and open, transparent systems. I think that's really the mission of Shenzhen.
Okay. Xiaogang, Fu Jun, Yukong Huang, Xu Jun-O, and Marco Forster, thank you so much for your contribution to a splendid story about Shenzhen, and certainly the brainstorm session about reform and opening paths for China in the near future. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for this special edition of World Insight, 40th anniversary of Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. Best luck to Shenzhen and also to China's reform and opening up agenda in the next stage. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight, or you can also tune in to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.